In the last few lectures, I've been talking about some of the uh, historical context in which Newton was doing his work, and I hope you bear with me as I talk about this because I think it's really interesting to think about the relationship between science and philosophy. And that's something that Newton was very interested in. It's something that Galileo was very interested in. And it's something that really shaped the way that they were developing their work. So what I've been doing the last couple of lectures is giving a brief review of Aristotelian natural philosophy. That is his philosophy of nature, talking about Aristotle's four causes, that sets a criteria for what we mean by understanding a natural object. And in particular, I talked about the distinction between substantial forms and accidental forms. In this lecture, I want to go a little bit further and talk about the relationship between science and religion, or I guess more precisely between natural philosophy and theology. So far, we have been discussing natural philosophy, that is, how we think about nature, and how it was shaped by these Aristotelian categories. For example, Aristotle's four causes, and the distinction between substantial form and accidental form. How the ancients and the medievals thought about nature also affected how they thought about theology. So I'd like to say a few things about this, and especially one of the biggest issues, the doctrine of transubstantiation, which was kind of a key issue in both natural philosophy and theology at this time. So the doctrine of transubstantiation, or what are we actually eating during the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper? This might seem like just a theological issue, but it's also an issue of natural philosophy or science, according to people at this time. So this doctrine of transubstantiation that was advocated by the Roman Catholic Church was really formulated using Aristotle's categories. So let me explain this. Normally, what an object is, its substantial form, as Aristotle would say, does not change. But its accidents, its accidental form, may change. So for example, I may cut my hair, but I am still me. So my substantial form isn't changing, and yet I have this accident of, that's the term that was used, of the length of my hair. So I'm still me even if I cut my hair. In the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, the idea, according to the doctrine of transubstantiation, is that the substantial form itself changes while the accidents remain the same. So that's kind of the opposite scenario. So let me explain. So according to, again, to this doctrine of transubstantiation, before the consecration of the elements, the bread and wine, by the priest, the bread and the wine are the bread and the wine. They look and feel and taste like bread and wine as well. After they're blessed or consecrated by the priest, they then are the body and blood of Christ. They have changed their substantial form, but they still look and feel and taste like bread and wine. They have retained the accidental form of bread and wine. So the substance or the substantial form changes, even though the accidents remain the same. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because in modern philosophy, specifically modern natural philosophy, as introduced by Descartes and Galileo, these kinds of categories were rejected. In particular, Descartes, the French philosopher that was around the time of Galileo, he rejected the Aristotelian category of substantial form altogether. This was seen, by the way, as an attack on both natural philosophy, or the science of the time, and theology. So how did Descartes think about things? In a letter that he wrote in 1642, he claimed, I'm going to read a part of this. He says, substantial forms, the idea of substantial forms, were introduced by philosophers merely to account for the action of some natural things. But no natural action at all can be explained by these substantial forms. Since their defenders, the people who like these, the defenders admit that they are occult or hidden causes, and that they do not understand these substantial forms themselves. If they say that some action proceeds from a substantial form, it is as if they said it proceeds from something they do not understand, which really explains nothing. So that's what Descartes said. He wanted to get rid of this idea of substantial forms because he thought they really didn't explain anything. Descartes is basically saying that since substantial forms are not understood, they don't really provide an explanation for anything. Only things that we understand should really be given as causes for things in nature. Now, this may sound very scientific, right? What Descartes is doing, but it really severely restricts the kinds of explanations that we can provide, probably in ways that we would find too restrictive. So let me give you an example. So let's suppose that someone gets shot, right? And you want to know why this person was shot. Like, let's suppose someone shoots another person, and you say, why did he shoot him? Well, an explanation that might be given would be because the person who shot him was jealous. Okay. Now, we seem to think that this is a reasonable explanation that kind of accounts for why someone would shoot someone else, but do we fully understand jealousy or why the person was jealous? Well, probably not. And yet we still gain an understanding by this kind of cause, by the account of jealousy. Or another example that's a little less, I guess, everyday and a little bit more scientific, why are the stars in a galaxy arranged in a particular way? Well, one of the reasons that modern science provides or suggests is because of something called dark matter or dark energy can account for the distribution of stars. Now, do we understand dark matter or dark energy? No, and yet we appeal to it as a causal explanation. It's a similar kind of thing when we appeal to things like the conservation of energy. There are these fundamental things that we don't truly understand why they're the case, and yet we use them as explanations for something else. So it's not uncommon, I guess this is my point, it's not uncommon to appeal to something we don't fully understand in order to account for some kind of effect. Okay, so what really did Descartes want to replace this Aristotelian approach to natural philosophy with? In other words, if a natural thing, a tree, was not composed of matter and a substantial form, then what really was it? So again, Descartes wanted to get rid of this whole idea of substantial forms because they didn't really explain anything. Well, most things, according to Descartes, were just extended objects. He used the term res extensa. So rocks and trees, animals, plants, there was no need, according to Descartes, to talk about substantial forms. Extended objects like these, rocks, trees, animals, plants, they're just made of atoms, and they could be entirely understood in terms of the spatial arrangement of the atoms that made them up. So here we're starting to see this very modern approach. So if you just understand where the atoms are located in an object, then you truly understand that object. Really, objects like rocks, plants, trees, and so on, they're like machines or artifacts, only they lacked any kind of accidental, let alone substantial form. There was no need to talk about forms at all. Now, this is the view of Descartes. No need to talk about forms. All you need to talk about is the arrangement of atoms. Now, I said most things are simply extended objects, according to Descartes, but there's one thing that is not merely an extended object, and that thing is man, or people. So he is an extended object, a res extensa, according to Descartes, but he is also a thinking object, a res cogitans. He alone, or people alone, have the capacity to think and to reflect. So man is really made of two things. He's both an extended object that takes up space, like rocks and plants and trees and animals and so on, and other machines, but he's also a thinking object, a res cogitans, that does not take up space. So you might wonder, why does all this matter? Well, it matters a lot, not merely for how we understand nature. That is, can we truly understand nature by thinking of it as comprised of matter alone, as extended objects, or as mere configurations of atoms, but also how we understand theology. After all, if there are no substantial forms, as Descartes was claiming, then it really doesn't make any sense to talk about transubstantiation, right? So the Roman Catholic Church saw Descartes' attack on substantial forms really as an attack on a theological doctrine. If things such as bread can be completely understood by the configuration of its atoms, and if there's really no change in the configuration of the atoms of bread during the Lord's Supper or during the Eucharist, then there's really no change at all during the Lord's Supper. It's really both bread before the consecration and after the consecration. There's no change, there's no transubstantiation. And this is seen as heresy, of course. So a lot is riding on how we understand nature. So with that, I want to now, that gives a bit of a background on sort of the natural philosophy and how it was related to theological issues at the time. So what I'm going to do in the next lecture is talk about specifically Newton and where Newton comes in and what Newton is trying to do in his mathematical principles of natural philosophy.